Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. And as for this week's title, I'll be chatting about the review copy I received of SwordSwipe Studios' speedy action platformer, Gaiden. Specifically, was this drone-centric dive difficult but delightful, or did it leave me feeling lobotomized by the end of my experience? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The Golden Skulls, artifacts possessed of unfathomable power. A power coveted by the menacing Giorko, whose mysterious plans would seem him mobilizing the full might of his mechanical minions that he might claim their strength. Faced with the dire possibilities of, well, something, no doubt awful, waiting to occur, a pair of steel shinobi are deployed to foil him at every turn. And if you're feeling a little lost here, don't worry, the game isn't expecting you to take all that seriously. In fact, while the game does introduce the premise in its opening cutscene, it'll be pretty close to the climax that you'll be given the altogether hilarious reason for the chain of events you've endured. Which means, in the interim, all that pre-stage banter with the bosses, that's essentially there just to highlight how dysfunctionally quirky the various boss spots are, and to sneak in absolutely as many puns and bits of wordplay as possible. Like, I am seriously in awe of just how many times I had to suppress the urge to slap my forehead or groan after a given exchange, since they'd be right at home in a cartoon featuring some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or in one of my scripts. Enough that I wasn't actually expecting the clever twists contained within the epilogue. That said, since I'm trying to avoid spoilers, now's as good a time as any to mosey over to the mechanics. Now, at its core, Gaiden sounds straightforward enough. It's an action-oriented platformer that lets you freely choose between its 6 stages and challenge their metallic masters. Get those out of the way, and you unlock the final showdown with Giorko. Giorkio? You know, I'm actually not pronouncing his names right, I can guarantee it, but just no. That said, despite the simplicity of this game, it's fairly savage. When I first cracked it open, I passed over the first stage and its tutorial, hopping straight into the second stage, where I was promptly slapped silly for a good 20 minutes. Whilst the stages aren't overly long, Gaiden's levels would be right at home on the NES, given their deadfalls, carefully placed enemies, and sneaky ambushes. It was a sobering introduction, and one that taught me both caution, and which seared the level's layout into my brain from the repeated trauma of dying. It also obliged me to get very familiar with the basic kit and controls and what it could do, after I doubled back to the tutorial level to properly learn what I could do. Notably, you start out with a basic jump, a helpful glide, and a melee attack that can reflect projectiles. You can also dodge, but it's a sort of persnickety feature in the sense that it rarely worked out for me. See, the dodge roots you in place, so if enemies jump onto your location, such as certain almost screen-sized bosses, you're going to eat shit. Not immediately, mind you, but the moment you let go of the dodge. Because you have to, since you'll just self-destruct if you hold it too long. Really, I found myself only using the dodge to recover from being knocked back, since it would at least recover from something that might have otherwise sent me sprawling off a ledge and into the void. That said, it wasn't just my relationship with the dodge button that coaxed me into cautiously advancing. Oh no, that bit of anxiety can be squarely laid at the feet of the power-up system and how it works. See, as you progress through the levels, you'll find all sorts of power-up icons helpfully strewn in your path. These icons provide their boosts in order, starting with the double jump, then moving on to a ranged shuriken attack, and finally ending with a dash. A dash which reflects all projectiles it slams into. There's just a small problem here, and it's if you get hit by anything, you lose a power-up, and it's entirely possible to find yourself overwhelmed in a dicey situation and just get bounced around for a moment until you lose every one. That's unless you're playing on a higher difficulty, in which case you just lose all of them at once on the first hit. Woo! Yeah. And this hurts a lot, not only because of what each icon represents on their own, but once you're at full capacity for power-ups, you earn a hefty speed boost. Now you might be wondering, after everything I mentioned about caution, why I'd want to zip headlong through the level and possibly into bullets, and that's the other half of Bot Gaiden's difficulty. It expects you to be fast. Fast, but flawless, and it offers some hefty incentives to do just that. The first reason is fairly self-explanatory. By clearing levels, you earn permanent power-ups, starting with a generic extra life for the simple fact of doing it, but extending to power-ups which change your kit provided you do it within a certain clear time. I'm talking options like starting out with the ability to double jump or dash, making the ninja star a spread shot, or my favorite ability, the time stop, which literally prevents even the timer from going up. It's fantastic. And the other reason of why it's fantastic is due to the other factor that incentivizes speed, namely the end of stage bosses. Now, these guys are pretty varied insofar as their patterns, and tend to be fairly brutal insofar as how much leeway you have when fighting them, especially if you wind up walking into one without your power-ups. What's worse, however, is the fact that the longer you mill about a stage or find your attempts at finesse foiled by fiendish foes, the more time they have to absorb the power from the skull they guard and gain a bigger health pool. Which is where time stop comes in, since if you can figure out the most efficient path to pile forward and continuously beeline through the various power-ups, it's entirely possible to sneak into a boss fight while it's as helpless as an anemic jellyfish. At that point, even their penchant for extending invulnerability frames by sitting on you doesn't really matter. It really makes the process of learning the various stages and mastering their routes feel intensely satisfying, because there are optimal routes to take in order to shave off precious seconds, both to earn better items and to avoid a drawn-out encounter. That said, while there is a certain sort of difficulty in figuring out these optimal paths to take in order to maximize the power-ups and keep them, all while avoid being hit, there is a certain point where your steady acquisition of power-ups will make the last few segments feel like a foregone conclusion. A fun romp, but not the nightmare of your earlier encounters. And then you reach the finale, and all bets are off. I'm not kidding here either. I squeezed out every upgrade I could from the earlier stages, and I still found it to be a grueling marathon. Not only is it riddled with extremely lethal enemies and deadlier stage design, it's just long. To the point that even with its boosted time limit, I still found myself sorely pressed to get that final gold skull. I mean, I did it, and frankly, while there were certain spikes of frustration in the process, I ultimately did have a decent amount of fun, and there is admittedly more content to dive into for those hungry for further suffering, since you can unlock an alternate game mode. Frankly, now that I think about it, that could have been interesting for when I decided to dive into the co-op, but well, in and of itself, co-op was a challenging hurdle for me. I played this with Hop, and both me and him were getting confused over who was who, given that it's shared screen co-op. That and the online Steam share can be a bit of a potato at times, so he managed to burn through all 9 of his lives in record time. That said, I did enjoy zipping through the level, forcing him to teleport to my location, and seeing him try to figure out what to do. Very satisfying, 10 on 10 messing with a friend potential, though in hindsight, I never got to find out if he could just kill a boss by self-destructing repeatedly. Die less, Hop, until I ask you to die more. Anyways, that brings us to aesthetic time, and while there is that whole hiccup I just mentioned with confusion in co-op, overall I'd have to say that Bot Gaiden looks pretty nice, with the highlight for me being its enemy design. There's some nice looking baddies to bop, the bosses are actually pretty impressive. That said, some of you folks might be a bit more interested in one of the post-game unlockables, since you can earn some alternate graphic styles which pay homage to earlier styles of gaming. That and a nifty alternate costume which also changes up how the game plays a little bit. What's more, however, the sound design is solid enough that even when I found myself stuck on a level for 30 odd minutes in a horrifying death loop, I found myself still nodding along to the tunes, so that's saying something. Overall, I just have to say that it's honestly pretty solid. While it's not the longest title, given that I clocked in just a hair under 2.5 hours, I genuinely enjoyed puzzling out how best to efficiently tackle each of its stages to earn an optimal time, and then putting those plans to test in hectic dashes that put everything I'd learned on the curriculum. And that felt good. It felt really good, a test of my wits and reflexes that I'd surprisingly passed. But well, it's not a flawless experience. I'll wholly admit that. While I rose to the challenge provided by the stages, I was certainly motivated by how much I disliked fighting the bosses. Some of them simply didn't feel fair. The Yeti has a vast sweeping attack and the ability to glut the screen with a swarm of nuisances. Elements which can be surmounted if you have power-ups or unlock certain upgrades, but which are essentially a death sentence in my initial attempts when I had none of those things, and his health pool was looking larger than a matchstick. That's not to say there aren't enjoyable boss encounters. For instance, I really found it fun to puzzle out the chameleon boss, and the last boss could hold his own even with all my upgrades, but those brutal earlier encounters more or less trained me to endlessly reset the level until I could get through a stage flawlessly and skip as much of the boss as possible, which meant that the latter half of my romp through Gaiden was marked by bosses getting deleted before they could make an impression, favorable or otherwise. That made this game a bit trickier to rate, honestly. There were certainly moments during the experience, both near the beginning and the end, which were punctuated with extreme frustration, and yet I stuck with it. And by doing so, I not only started to overcome its challenges, I found myself warming up to it considerably. Still, it does find itself in a sort of weird position difficulty-wise, given that it's initially a hard nut to crack, but once you start progressing, that difficulty begins to evaporate at an exponential rate. And that's ultimately why I wound up rating it as a fumble. If you are a major fan of platformers and you're intrigued by what I said, I would certainly recommend giving it a try, but having gone through it thoroughly, I can see why someone might be put off by the experience. That, and because they didn't have a controller, or hated the fact that they couldn't remap the controls. The load times are also a bit potato, too. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patrons you can support me and Hop. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.